Welcome everyone, welcome back to the YouTube channel. Today we're going to cover a topic that affects many children and young individuals in education, especially in the education system. So that is the school to prison pipeline, which was originally an issue in the United States, but similar patterns here have emerged in the UK. This term describes the systemic process by which young people, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, are pushed out of mainstream education into the criminal justice system. So in the UK, factors such as school exclusions, policies, racial and socio-economic disparities, police presence in schools and inadequate support systems contribute to this phenomenon. So let's explore why the school to prison pipeline exists in the UK, analysing its causes, consequences and potential solutions. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with understanding the school to prison pipeline in the UK. So the school to prison pipeline in the UK refers to the systemic processes through which educational policies and disciplinary practices disproportionately affect marginalised students, increasing their likelihood of involvement in the criminal justice system. Now, this phenomenon is not just the result of a single factor, but rather a combination of structural inequalities, institutional biases and socio-economic disadvantages that create a cycle of education failure and criminalisation. So research has consistently shown that school exclusions, both temporary and permanent, serve as a critical gateway into the pipeline. So students who are excluded from mainstream education often face significant disruptions to their learning, limited access to support services and a higher likelihood of disengagement from education altogether. Many of these students are funneled into alternative provisions, which have been criticised for their lack of resources, high dropout rates and increased exposure to negative peer influences. Studies indicate that young people who pass through APs are significantly more likely to become involved in criminal activity and the justice system. A lack of inadequate support for students with special educational needs, also known as SEN, further exacerbates the issue. So many students who struggle with undiagnosed or unsupported learning disabilities such as autism spectrum disorders or behavioural difficulties find themselves penalised rather than supported. Without early intervention strategies and individualised learning plans, these students often experience repeated disciplinary actions, ultimately increasing their risk of exclusion and future encounters with the criminal justice system. Now, I need you to listen to the next part very carefully, as I will cover this in more detail later. So, racial discrimination is another key factor in the school to prison pipeline. Minority students, particularly students of colour, are disproportionately subjected to harsher disciplinary measures, including suspensions and exclusions, compared to their white peers. Implicit bias and systemic racism within the education system contribute to the over-policing of these students, reinforcing negative stereotypes and increasing their likelihood of criminalisation from a very early age. Additionally, austerity-driven funding cuts have severely impacted schools and community services that provide essential support for at-risk youth. Reductions in mental health provisions, youth services and after-school programmes and pastoral care mean that many vulnerable students lack the safety nets needed to keep them engaged in education and out of criminal justice system. The absence of these crucial interventions leaves young people without constructive alternatives, increasing the chances that they will fall into cycles of poverty, exclusion and ultimately incarceration. Now, we have to have an understanding of the school to prison pipeline, and that requires recognizing the interconnected nature of these issues and the urgent need for systemic reform. Without meaningful changes to education policies, investment in student support services, and dismantling of discriminatory practices, the UK risks perpetuating a cycle that disproportionately impacts already disadvantaged communities. Now, limiting opportunities for success and reinforcing social inequalities. Now, most of the following information I'm discussing came from the report which was issued the 5th of September 2024, and it's a research by the Institute for Public Policy Research, so that's the IPPR. So the key factors contributing to the school to prison pipeline is one, school exclusions and the link to criminality. One of the most significant drivers of school to prison pipeline in the UK is the high rate of school exclusions. Permanent and fixed term exclusions disproportionately affect black, working class and neurodiverse students. The further new analysis of the 2022 and 23 data has also revealed that a record 32 million days of learning were lost by pupils of all ages due to a combination of unauthorised absences and exclusions. 32 million people. 32 million. Exclusions often occur due to behavioural issues, but these issues they're frequently linked to unmet educational or emotional needs. Instead of receiving additional support, many excluded students are placed in alternate provisions or in alternate provision settings known for the lack of resources and high dropout rates. Now, many people who attend alternate provision struggle to reintegrate back into mainstream education and are at greater risk of involvement in crime. Now, number two, that's racial disparities in school discipline. So, racial disparities in school discipline policies mirror broader inequalities in the UK's educational and justice system. So, black students are 3 times more likely to be excluded from school than their white peers, according to the research by the Runnymede Trust, which is RUNNYMEDE Trust. These disparities are often attributed to the implicit bias, systemic racism, and the lack of culturally responsive teaching methods. Within this, we have the poorest students, so those who get free school meals are nearly 5 times more likely to be permanently excluded and 4 times more likely to be suspended than their peers. The poorest areas of England have the highest rates of lost learning through unauthorised absences and suspensions. So, as an example, Middlesbrough has a suspension rate of 3 times the national average, which is like theirs is at 28.18% compared to the national average, which is only 9.33%. Children from some ethnic minority backgrounds are disproportionately being placed in alternate provisions, or also known as APs or AIPs, away from mainstream schools. These include children from Black Caribbean, so they're 2.5 times more likely than average. Roman and Gypsy, or Roma and Irish traveller, they're 4 times more likely. And children with mixed Black Caribbean and white heritage, they're 2.5 times more likely. Children with mental health needs are 3 times as likely to have to move schools than their peers, and those with mental health needs so severe that it is classed as SEN, special educational needs, are 17 times more likely to be educated in AP schools serving excluded pupils than they are to appear in the general population. Number 3, austerity measures and cuts to the youth services. So, austerity policies implemented over the last decade have drastically reduced funding for youth services, mental health support and educational resources. Many local authorities have been forced to cut back on after-school programs, youth centres and intervention services, and that once provided at-risk youth with alternatives to crime. The cuts in social services means that many students with additional needs go unidentified and unsupported without the proper intervention. These students are more likely to struggle academically and behaviourally, increasing their risk of exclusion and eventual involvement into the criminal justice system. Now we're going to number 4. So number 4 is special educational needs and disabilities. So that's SEND and the pipeline. Students with special educational needs and disabilities are disproportionately affected by school exclusion policies. Research by the Institute of Policy, by the Public Policy Research, found that 45% of young people in custody have been excluded from school, and a significant proportion of these individuals have undiagnosed or unsupported learning difficulties. Now, many students with conditions such as autism, ADHD and dyslexia require tailored support, which is often lacking in mainstream education. Instead of receiving appropriate accommodations, these students are frequently punished for behaviours linked to their disabilities, increasing their likelihood of being excluded. So now we'll move on to the consequences of school to prison pipeline in the UK. Now, the school to prison pipeline has far-reaching consequences, not only for the students directly affected, but also for society as a whole. So, number 1, the increased likelihood of incarceration. So students of any colour who are excluded from school or placed in alternate provision are significantly more likely to become involved in criminal activity. Research from the Ministry of Justice shows that 85% of young people in custody were persistent absent from school before their imprisonment. 85%. And that's the Ministry of Justice that have found that information. It's not me making that up, okay? Number 2, the economic and social costs. So the school to prison pipeline contributes to cycles of poverty and unemployment. So young people who leave school without qualifications face limited job opportunities, increasing their likelihood of engaging in criminal activity. This in turn places a financial burden on the criminal justice system and the social welfare programs. Now, if we're talking about the costs, let's talk about the costs to the state. Now, new analysis for the report finds that lifetime costs of at least 170,000 per child directly associated with permanent exclusion. For last year's excluded cohort alone, this means the cost to the state was of 1.6 billion over a lifetime. Youth violence. Half of young people serving custodial sentences are persistently absent from school, and 3/4 have been suspended at least once. The attainment gap. 90% of excluded pupils do not achieve a pass in GCSE maths or English. Youth unemployment. There are overwhelmingly poor outcomes for excluded children, with over half of children not entered for maths and English GCSEs in alternative provision schools, and fewer than 5% gaining a standard pass. You have to make it make sense. Number 3, psychological and emotional impact. So, exclusion from school and interactions with the criminal justice system can have lasting psychological effects on young people. Many experience feelings of alienation or low self-worth and a sense of hopelessness. This can lead to further disengagement from education and society, making reintegration difficult. Now we move on to strategies for addressing the school to prison pipeline in the UK. This is the strategies. Dismantling the school to prison pipeline requires a systemic change in the education policy, youth justice and social support system. Several key strategies can help mitigate these issues. So, number 1, reforming exclusion policies. There is a growing call for alternative disciplinary approaches that focus on intervention rather than exclusion. Schools should adopt restorative justice practices and encourage conflict resolution and behavioural support rather than punitive measures. Again, a lot of parents who are out there will tell you about some of these, why the children are getting put in isolation, which then turns into exclusion. Number two, increasing investment in early interventions. Providing early support for at-risk students can prevent school disengagement. Schools should work closely with social services, mental health professionals and community organisations to identify and assist students who may be struggling. Number three, addressing racial disparities in education. Training teachers and school staff on cultural competence and implicit bias can help reduce racial disparities in school discipline. Additionally, implementing policies that promote diversity and inclusion can create a more equitable educational environment. Number four, enhancing support for SEND students or SEND students. Investing in better resources and training for educators working with SEND students can help prevent unnecessary exclusions. Providing personalised learning plans, specialised support staff and alternative accommodations can ensure that these students receive the education they really need. Now, final one is number five, restoring youth services and community programs. We all know about the cuts that are being made, so reinvesting in youth services and community programs can provide young people with positive outlets and mentorship opportunities. Programs that focus on skill development, extracurricular activities and employment pathways can help steer students away from the criminal justice system. Now, guys, we always finish with final thoughts and call to action. So I will give my final thoughts now. The school to prison pipeline in the UK is deeply entrenched and multifaceted issue that disproportionately affects marginalised and vulnerable students. Driven by systemic factors such as school exclusions, racial disparities and the presence of law enforcement in education settings, austerity-driven funding cuts and inadequate support for students with special educational needs, this pipeline pushes young people towards the criminal justice system rather than equipping them with the tools for success. Now, breaking this cycle requires a fundamental rethinking of education policies and disciplinary practices. Schools must shift away from punitive measures and embrace restorative justice approaches that emphasises conflict resolution, mentorship and student well-being. Increased investment in early intervention programs, mental health resources and inclusive educational strategies is essential to ensuring that all students, regardless of their background, receive the support that they need to thrive. Education should be a gateway to opportunity, not a path to incarceration. By fostering a culture of inclusion, addressing systemic inequalities and implementing proactive student-centred policies, the UK can work towards dismantling the school to prison pipeline and creating a more just and equitable education system, ensuring that every young person has access to quality education, guidance and support is not just a moral imperative, but it's a necessary step towards a fairer society. Now remember this please. It costs £150,000 a year to keep a young person in prison. However, it costs on average £46,000 a year to send a young person to Eton, where Prince William and Prince Harry went to. Almost 4 times more to keep a young person in prison. Please make that make sense. I mean, you've just got to look. I mean, 150,000 to keep someone in jail, 46,000 to send someone to one of the best education systems in the country, in Eton. So engaging in these conversations is crucial for sparking change and amplifying the voice of those affected. Together, we can work towards a future where every student is given the chance to succeed. Now, yeah, if you found this discussion valuable, or what I've had to say, or you've enjoyed it, then please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and also share. It really helps bring more voices into these discussions. So I'll see you on the next one. Until next time, please take care.